The term toxic masculinity has recently become the subject of much discussion in online spaces. You've more than likely seen this phrase used either by progressives attempting to make societal critiques or detractors of those progressives, mocking them for calling all masculinity toxic. And that latter group is who I wanted to talk about today. For all the discourse surrounding toxic masculinity, I've noticed a pretty big trend of people not caring to discuss what it actually is. So that's what I wanted to do today, create a comprehensive overview of what people mean when they talk about toxic masculinity and all the misunderstandings that result from it. But first, a small disclaimer. I don't hate masculinity, I actually quite enjoy doing things that are typically thought of as masculine. I work out, I have a beard, I have a bald patch, and I'm subscribed to Chris Bumstead on YouTube. And I feel like I have to qualify all of these things because of a specific type of reactiveness towards the concept of toxic masculinity. A reactiveness that's probably caused a few people watching to already brush me off as a soy boy without hearing me out first. And I think it's those same rigid definitions and need to conform to them that, in a lot of cases, ends up hurting men in the long run. I think that if we want to help men, we should examine the expectations and standards that we're holding them to, and maybe reevaluate them a bit. And no, that doesn't mean men should just give up and die without a purpose. Did you even listen to anything I said? Jesus Christ. What isn't toxic masculinity? If I'm going to clear up some misunderstandings of what toxic masculinity is, I feel like it's useful to start off by discussing everything that toxic masculinity isn't. One of the main frustrations I've had in recent years is that this concept seems to get misrepresented in some really strange ways which don't really hold up all that well under scrutiny. So let's scrutinize. The most common response you'll see when someone criticizes toxic masculinity is the whole, "Oh, so now all masculinity is toxic now, is it?" routine. And this has always frustrated me because in their attempt to look smart, the people who say this stuff end up looking really clueless. If I tell you not to eat poisonous food, would you think I'm telling you to avoid all food? Or that all food is poisonous? Of course not, because I'm referring to a specific type of food. That's what adjectives are for. I don't understand how you can unironically say stuff like this as if it doesn't demonstrate a severe lack of understanding of basic grammar. Even Joe Rogan himself is guilty of this. In episode 1412 of his podcast with Jimmy Dore, he says this.
And then you got women dismissing it because they think that the men who express it in an honest way are pigs and sexist, and they exhibit toxic masculinity, that's a hilarious expression, because you need to thank toxic masculinity for all the bridges, all the jets, all the rockets, all this toxic masculinity.
Now, this is guilty of something else that I see a lot of staunch masculinity defenders do, wherein they take toxic masculinity to mean anything that men did, which, I mean, come on, those are two different sentences. It's also ironic to me that Joe decides to hit back with the whole toxic masculinity gave us rockets argument, as though that doesn't completely disregard the numerous women who contributed to the space race in 1962. A man taking credit for women's achievements because it helps protect his ego? I wonder what kind of mindset would cause him to do that. Someone should come up with a phrase to describe things like this. But in all seriousness, this is the kind of rhetorical sleight of hand that's been really frustrating to see recently, because not only is it wrong, it's also dishonest. It demonstrates, at best, a complete unwillingness to reflect on attitudes that can lead to a lot of harm, and at worst, the acceptance and maybe even encouragement of those same attitudes. So, now that we've refreshed our grammar knowledge and we know that toxic masculinity doesn't mean all masculinity and it doesn't mean all men, but rather the specific approaches towards masculinity that can result in harm, we can now ask, how can masculinity cause harm? Water is pretty good. I personally can't live without it. But what would happen if I were to drink more than I needed, possibly more than I could handle? Maybe I'm happy with how much water I drink, but I keep reading all these blog posts that say I need more to really stay hydrated. So I keep drinking and drinking. Even after it gets uncomfortable, I keep going because, well, it's what others say I'm supposed to do. So I push past all that discomfort and I keep going until, oh, look at that, now I have water intoxication and brain damage. What you have there is a classic case of too much of a good thing. Trying to ignore your own limitations in order to get more of it, to the point that it actually becomes harmful. And look, it's pretty obvious where I'm going with this, right? It's the same thing with masculinity. On its own, it's perfectly fine. But that over-reliance on masculinity in order to meet societal expectations is where things can become harmful, or even dangerous. Dare I say, toxic? I realize I haven't given any concrete examples yet, so let me briefly examine some qualities associated with traditional masculinity and examine how leaning too far into them can have some detrimental side effects. Now, there's a lot of things that broader society associates with masculinity that are, at face value, pretty good. Things like bravery, strength, assertiveness, and leadership are all pretty admirable traits. But remember, we're looking at toxicity being the result of too much of a good thing. So how can these traits be taken too far? It's good to be brave, for sure, but what about trying to be brave all the time, to the point that it causes you to take unnecessary risks because that's what real men do? You don't want to be a pussy, do you? So come on, be a man. Or what about assertiveness or leadership? Again, these traits are admirable, but what about when you try way too hard to take charge or assert yourself in a place where it isn't necessary? Because, again, that's what men are supposed to do. This is something that many women have had to deal with in the workplace. Many studies have demonstrated that society treats men and boys as more credible than women and girls, when the science demonstrates that it should be the opposite. And that assumption is then adopted by those men and boys and used against their female counterparts to reinforce what's referred to as the authority gap. Now, this leads me to a pretty common defense of behaviors like this, which is when people up and exclaim, "Hey, wait a minute, how do you know that these guys are doing this stuff because they're men? Maybe they're just pricks that happen to be men." And this is something you'll often hear brought up during conversations about toxic masculinity and its side effects, how it's not masculinity that's to blame, but the people who just happen to be masculine. And this argument has always frustrated me because it misses a key piece of the argument, that the people doing these things often have their actions informed by what they think masculinity is. Remember, we live in a society that has certain expectations around what masculinity is. These men are a part of that society, and whether consciously or unconsciously, are aware of society's expectations of them. Considering the fact that even kids are aware of these expectations, it's highly unlikely that they forget by the time they reach adulthood. But let me give you another example in case you don't believe me just yet. One of the central aspects of masculinity that you've probably heard yourself is that of strength, not just physical, but emotional. Boys are told from a young age that men are supposed to be tough, that they can't appear outwardly weak or soft for fear of not being a real man. And where has this gotten us? We're in the midst of a male suicide epidemic. They refuse to seek help because of how it would make them look, and it's killing them. The stoicism to suicide pipeline is a result of men not feeling able to be vulnerable because of these intense, rigid expectations from society of how men should be. And bear in mind, these are all side effects of the things that we actually like about masculinity. It's bad enough that these undeniably good qualities like strength and leadership can be taken to the point that they do more harm than good. But what about the aspects of masculinity that society doesn't necessarily condone, but expects nonetheless? Things like anger, or getting into fights, or being the pursuer in sexual relationships. These aren't good traits like bravery or strength, but you'd be deluded to say that they aren't expected of men. And much like the traits we already discussed, the expectation of these traits can blind us to some pretty damaging behavior. Let's go back to that Joe Rogan clip from earlier to see what I'm talking about. This conversation, where Joe credits a bunch of women's accomplishments to masculinity, comes as a result of his guest, Jimmy Dore, talking about a play he'd seen and describes it as follows.
Picasso's painting and he's talking and he says an artist must stay well fucked. Otherwise, his eye goes from the page to the windowsill, down to the street, across, over to the cafe where the girl's sitting with her skirt up. And it's like that always stuck with me, right? If an artist doesn't stay well fucked, all he's going to be doing is thinking about getting laid.
Yeah, men will understand that.
They then go on to discuss how testosterone increases male libido, and that it's ridiculous to say it's toxic to acknowledge this basic biological function.
Well, it's not just that. It's a biological imperative. It's a reason why people breed.
Right.
It's like that's built into the DNA to make people attracted to females so they can spread their DNA. And that's what it is.
And there are some observations I have about this little snippet. First, the play that his guest, Jimmy Dore, is referring to is Steve Martin's Picasso at the Lapin Agile, wherein Picasso and Einstein, both on the verge of their greatest achievements, have a fictional conversation along with a bunch of other side characters. The play is, for all intents and purposes, a character examination of these two historical figures. The scene that Dore describes is mostly there, save for a key difference. Listen to how Dore explains it again.
And he says an artist must stay well fucked. Otherwise, his eye goes from the page to the windowsill, down to the street, across, over to the cafe where the girl's sitting with her skirt up.
And now here's how the scene is actually phrased. I did 16 drawings today, 2 in pencil, the rest in ink. All women. What does that tell you? It tells me a painter has got to stay well fucked. Otherwise, the mind drifts off the easel, out the window, and across the street to the grocer's daughter. It's a lot less provocative in how it describes the girl his attention drifts towards, and for good reason. The play is criticizing Picasso's attitude. Later on, one of the bartenders, Jermaine, rips into him for how he views women and sex, saying things like, "You like them young because you can bamboozle them. You want them when you want them, but never when they want you. You are lucky because you have a true talent, one that you're too wise to abuse. And because of that, you will always be desirable. So when you wear out one woman, there will be another one who wants to taste it, who wants to be next to someone like you. So you'll never have to earn a woman, and you'll never appreciate one." I guess Jimmy wasn't paying attention to this part. Instead, he just heard that Picasso was obsessed with sex and thought, yeah, that's what men are like. Even though his whole attitude is deliberately constructed to be unsympathetic and indefensible, that doesn't matter to Jimmy. Picasso's actions falling under his, and by extension, Joe's idea of masculinity is what makes them defensible. They see his obsession with sex and lump it in with testosterone increasing male libido, as if to say, yeah, so what? This is what men are built for. Even though what they're doing is disregarding a lot of harmful behaviors that stem from this attitude. I mean, come on, man. If there's anyone I wouldn't trust as an example of healthy masculinity, it would be Pablo Picasso. You know, the guy who had a famously terrible attitude towards women and cheated on all of his wives. Dora Maar, one of his mistresses, once called him an extraordinary artist, but a morally worthless person. And this is the kind of attitude that these guys are basing their masculinity on. I don't know about you, but some of the stuff this Picasso guy did sounds pretty fucking toxic. You really dropped the cube with that one, Joe. It also betrays a deeper attitude towards masculinity shared by these two men. The idea that these harmful behaviors are unavoidable because of biology. It's like he's depriving men of any agency to be better than their base biological instincts because of testosterone. Which, again, sounds pretty damn toxic when it leads to you acting like Picasso did. But Joe likes to pretend that anybody who rejects this approach to masculinity only does it because it helps them get laid.
Right.
It's like that's built into the DNA to make people attracted to females so they can spread their DNA. And that's what it is. It's that simple.
It's it.
To deny that is crazy, but you've got men denying it because they want women to like them.
Yeah, man, if anyone disagrees with you, it's because they're a simp, not because they have, like, principles or self-control or any of that beta shit. They're just denying their true masculine purpose. Hey Joe, maybe if you didn't accept Picasso's brand of masculinity so readily, you wouldn't have cheated on your wife too. Oops. All of this is to say that this hyperfixation on masculinity and society's expectations of it is causing real and demonstrable harm, not just to people around the men with this attitude, but in many cases to those same men too. The problem isn't that masculinity exists, it never has been, that's a misdirection. The problem is that these harmful behaviors are informed by what people think it means to be a man, and then those same people never challenge those beliefs. In fact, we accept them, ignore them, and allow them to continue further, and this can have some pretty disastrous consequences. There are entire subsects of men and boys made up of people who, rather than questioning societies and their own standards of what makes you a real man, run purely on resentment for not meeting those standards. There's an entire movement centered around guys who have completely abandoned hope because they'll never meet society's expectations of masculinity, an ideology that makes young men want nothing more than to lay down and rot. The black pill. And what's the result of these men's desperation at never meeting these rigid expectations? People die. Elliot Rodger killed 6 people in 2014 because of an ideology just like this, a bitterness and resentment at not fulfilling society's expectations of him. He felt that he couldn't meet a role that was expected of him, in this case, getting girls, and because of this, he murdered 6 innocent people. And look, I'm not trying to undermine Elliot's agency in what he did, but you have to wonder how this could have been prevented if young men didn't keep themselves under the impression that their entire existence and worth is based on a few standards that they might never meet. And yeah, of course, incels are a small part of society, but they're representative of a bigger problem in that as long as we do keep these rigid expectations, there will always be those who fail to meet them and harm done as a result of that, either by people lashing out at never feeling man enough, or to the men that don't conform to what others expect of them. As long as people feel the need to engage in harmful or damaging behaviors unto themselves or others as a result of trying to meet some arbitrary standard of masculinity that's been set for them, the issue of toxic masculinity will always be relevant, truthful, and urgent until we find another way. I want to briefly highlight something I see a lot of when people discuss Elliot Rodger and people who share his belief system, or whenever any man causes harm informed by what he thinks true masculinity is. And this is the idea that, oh, real men don't do that, those people are just boys. It comes up all the time in discussions like these, and I'm sick of hearing it. The only purpose it serves is the smug self-assurance of the person saying it, so that they can pat themselves on the back and say, oh, I would never do that, aren't you proud of me? No, because you're missing the point. If somebody causes harm because they're trying to be a real man, and then you criticize them for not being a real man, you aren't rejecting the core ideology that informed their actions, the idea of masculinity being some gold standard that you have to constantly try and uphold, but simply the way that they went about expressing it. If you take it upon yourself to revoke somebody's man card because you don't like how they went about expressing it, it doesn't matter what intent you had, you're doing the thing and perpetuating the same fundamental set of beliefs that causes these problems to continue. As soon as we can acknowledge that these rigid expectations of masculinity and people's need to live up to it is what's causing all this toxicity, the sooner we can make a change for the better. Otherwise, we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over, and this can already be seen in the next generation. There's already studies being conducted on how these expectations of young men are having unintended, harmful side effects. One article written by the Daily Aus covers a series of new programs introduced to Australian schools in the efforts to bring healthy masculinity back to boys as young as 5 years old, to mitigate future instances of domestic violence. Pretty important, right? So you would expect that people would be on board with teaching these obviously young, impressionable schoolboys to approach masculinity in a healthier way, such as not thinking it's okay to beat women, right? Well, some of the biggest perpetrators of toxic masculinity are the same people who decry its existence the loudest. For an example of what I'm talking about, let me turn our attention to our good friend Isaac Butterfield. Isaac made his own video on this newspaper article, so I wanted to close off by looking at his video as an example of the defensiveness that currently surrounds a lot of masculinity discourse. Isaac begins his video by discussing the male suicide epidemic, which, remember, we've already uncovered is due to men not wanting to appear weaker or less manly by seeking help, which results in them taking their own life. But listen to how Isaac describes this concept.
The horrifying stats of men ending it all. All of that begins with teaching little boys, young men, that they are the problem. Not that they are part of the problem, that they are the problem because of the way that they were born.
Here we can see that Isaac is conflating the harmful effects of rigid masculine ideals, aka toxic masculinity, with anything related to any boy whatsoever, which, I mean, come on Isaac, I covered that at the start of the video, were you not paying attention? And after plugging his sponsor for this video, he then goes on to discuss the government's efforts to provide these kids with healthier approaches towards masculinity. And you would expect him to support this, right?
Boys as young as 5 will be taught about healthy relationships and masculinity. The government will teach you what healthy masculinity looks like. How about fuck off? Mate, I am fucking off governments from all over the world getting their hands on everything. Fuck off!
God damn it. Isaac continues to reframe the entire discussion throughout this whole video. He's so concerned with not addressing the harmful ways in which masculinity can manifest that he's willing to dishonestly frame this very basic program through the lens of, they're coming for your young men to tell them that they're inherently evil, when the truth is nowhere near that. And I can demonstrate undeniable proof that Isaac is actively lying to his audience about what this program's trying to achieve. Look at how Isaac presents this story. So he shows the first 2 slides that introduce the government's program.
The government's announced a program to crack down on toxic male culture and help young men develop positive masculinity. What the fuck is that? What the fuck is that? That's this whole do the right thing shit. Okay, what's positive masculinity then? Name it. Name exactly what it is. And I guarantee you the vast majority of men are already doing that shit.
And then, after going off on a tangent about Andrew Tate, he proceeds to discuss this slide about domestic violence. And we never learn what this article actually meant by healthy or unhealthy masculinity. At least, you wouldn't if you trusted Isaac's word as fact. But I don't. So I went looking for the article. Here's the 2 slides that Isaac shows one after the other to give the impression that this program is vague, nondescript, and doesn't actually clarify what it thinks good or bad masculinity is. You'll see that they're marked 2 and 4 respectively, so we can obviously gather that he's left a slide out for some reason. So what's on slide number 3? Well, it's an explanation of what the government means by healthy and unhealthy masculinity.
Positive masculinity. What the fuck is that?
You should know this, Isaac, because it's in the slide that you deliberately cut out of your video. Healthy masculinity, according to this program, means teaching boys how to have healthy relationships. Isaac just cut the middle slide out because it makes it easier for him to lie about what the government thinks masculinity is. And unsurprisingly, it's the same for what he says later in the video about harmful masculinity.
Shows strong links between harmful forms of masculinity. What is a harmful form of masculinity?
And again, Isaac knows what harmful masculinity is because he also cut this from his video. When this article talks about harmful masculinity, it's talking about the idea of male gender supremacy, the belief that men are inherently better than women. Isaac is deliberately misrepresenting what form of masculinity this article's talking about. It's nothing like all masculinity, but a harmful belief system of what masculinity is, which, once again, results in real harm being done, like the domestic violence that Isaac goes out of his way to condemn.
Domestic violence in Australia. This slide is very important because domestic violence is horrific, right? It should never happen. Any man who lays his hands on a woman is a huge piece of shit.
But look at his reaction to government programs designed to fight back against attitudes of male supremacy, which results in domestic violence.
How about fuck off? Mate, I am fucking off governments from all over the world getting their hands on everything. Fuck off!
And the unintended side effect of this is that Isaac is deliberately fighting against a program designed to prevent domestic abuse. Now, I'll be fair to Isaac, I'm pretty sure this was an unintended side effect of his need to defend the idea of masculinity at all costs. If he were to show this article fairly, he would be forced to admit that masculinity can lead to negatives when applied wrong, or that the government is right in trying to correct this. But if he lies, he gets to vaguely gesture about how great masculinity is, and all the positive ways it can manifest. He's lying about what the program actually thinks masculinity is, so that he can stoke the fears of his audience and pretend that all masculinity is under attack, rather than a harmful approach to it. And this need for Isaac to defend masculinity against the big bad government program designed to stop men from smacking their wives leads Isaac to repeat the policies of the government program to his audience as though he is the one that came up with it. Listen to what Isaac describes as healthy masculinity.
Here are some masculine traits: being strong, being powerful, being tough. These are good things. Using it for good is also a masculine trait. Other masculine traits include being helpful, being caring. If you see a dog hit by a car, you pull over, you help that fucking dog. Cooking for your family, little shit like that. Helping your wife, helping your partner clean up, sharing the load, 50-50. They are masculine traits.
Hey Isaac, this is what the program says. On the slide that he once again deliberately cut out because it undermines the point of his video, the article outlines some healthy approaches and avenues for masculinity. Things like respectful, healthy relationships and positive attitudes being taught in sports clubs. You're literally taking credit for what the program is already doing.
I just can't see the government telling boys and men how to be boys and men ending good, ending well, ending positively.
Well then why the fuck are you saying the same thing the government is then? Could it be that you don't believe in a single thing you're saying, you coward? All of this is in service of Isaac's biggest lie throughout this video, one that he repeats again and again, the lie that young men and masculinity are under attack. But that isn't the case. The harmful effects of strict approaches to masculinity, the misuse of these typically positive traits for selfish and harmful reasons, and the societal attitude that expects these actions of young men is what's being criticized. Nobody's telling young men that they're the problem. That's a lie peddled by bullshit merchants like Isaac in order to validate their audience's need to never re-examine what it means to be a man. If Isaac genuinely disagreed with what the article said or the aims of this program, he would have represented it fairly and made clear that he's arguing against stopping male supremacist ideals and agrees with the government on how to stop it. But he can't, because then he would have to take responsibility or a stance or admit that masculinity can sometimes have faults, or that maybe there are some ideas of masculinity that should be questioned. As a result, Isaac falls victim to his pride, his need to appear strong, to look like a leader, to put on a tough face and never admit fault for fear of seeming weak. He does these things because he knows it's expected of him, and his audience laps it up because they think it's what they need, even though what they're really doing is lapping up the empty words of a con artist who's demonstrated again and again that he doesn't really care to be a role model for the masculinity he defends so much. None of that matters to his viewers, because all they see is what they think a real man is, telling them that this is what real men do, and they accept it because they don't know any other way to be a man other than what they see before them, because Isaac won't allow them to see any other way. And I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty toxic to me. I just wanted to once again take a moment to say that this isn't a video against masculinity. I made this video because at the end of the day, these rigid definitions and expectations are hurting men. Whatever we're doing now in terms of forcing young men to act a specific way clearly isn't working. So why deflect and lie and misconstrue if all it does is cause these problems to continue and maybe even escalate further? We're in the middle of a male suicide epidemic because of this strict definition of masculinity that we're forcing men and boys to conform to. Maybe if we weren't so strict about what makes you a real man, people wouldn't be losing hope as often as they are right now. When people like Isaac deny that toxic masculinity is a very real and dangerous threat to these men and boys, all they do is deflect possible approaches that could let them see things in a different light and maybe even save their lives in the process. In the pinned comment as well as the description, you'll find links to several charities dedicated to developing healthy forms of masculinity as well as improving male mental health. Instead of leaving some comment calling me a cuck or woke soy boy or anything like that, I highly urge you to donate to one of those charities, instead of contributing to this mindset that puts men down for not acting like you think they should. Maybe if you did that, we could actually help men for once.